Oh, didn't see there. I was reading.
I don't know if you've noticed, but books are all over social media right now. Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, YouTube. No matter where on the internet you are, sooner or later you're likely to come across a picture of stylishly untidy bookshelves, or a person, typically a young woman, posing with her latest favorite read, or TikTok telling you which books are the latest hot girl novels, whatever those are. Kim Kardashian was right. It seems like everybody wants to read these days. I think that's what she said. And for the most part, people seem to agree that reading becoming a mainstream hobby is a good thing. However, the online book community has not been without its critics. From people worrying that literature is being commodified, to those who fear that TikTok will take over the publishing industry like it has done with the music industry. But the most interesting criticism comes from people who believe that book-related photo and video content has given rise to a reading aesthetic, in which users are more preoccupied with being perceived as readers rather than having a meaningful reading experience. It seems like every other week there's a new viral thread about how young women on social media are ruining literature, or another book influencer will get a DM from some weird guy telling her that she's just using books to take pretty pictures and she's so obviously not an intellectual. Like, get a job. Stay away from her. It seems to be the question on everybody's lips. Are these women actually reading all these books? Or are they just posting pictures of pretty book covers to get that bookish girl aesthetic? Before we answer that, let me give you a brief history of how the online book community came to be. People coming online to talk about books can be traced back to 2005-2006 when websites like Library Thing and Goodreads first came out. They first appeared as cataloging websites where people could find books and give them star ratings, and they quickly became the home of a sizable online community that revolved around reading, recommending, and reviewing books. Once social media platforms took off in the early 2010s, people began creating social media accounts exclusively for their hobbies, from fitness to cooking to art and fashion, and eventually books. At the time, the bookish community on Instagram, for example, was something of a countercultural gesture. Predominantly young women who felt like their interest in literature set them apart from their peers came here to talk about their favorite books. I was one of them. Follow me at According to Alina on Instagram. If you went onto Bookstagram, aka the bookish community on Instagram, somewhere between 2014 and 2017, you will have found a lot of people unironically calling themselves bookworms, and who also unironically put their Hogwarts house in their bio. And if you were really lucky, you might have come across some internalized misogyny and not like other girls' behavior as well, which was problematic. But it also showed people's desire to signal that at the time, reading was still somewhat of a niche interest. This began to change in the second part of the 2010s with the rise of wellness culture as well as influencer and hustle culture. On the one hand, growth and personal development gurus were recommending reading as a way of increasing productivity, while on the other, wellness brands and influencers began recommending reading as a tool towards spiritual and emotional development. Meanwhile, the rise of influencers to celebrity status triggered a strange defensive reaction in old-school Hollywood celebrities and pushed them to try and fortify their personal brands through the acquisition of cultural capital that they didn't really care for before. We see an increasing number of celebrities pictured holding books or in bookstores, and some of them even start their own book clubs. And I'm not saying that these people didn't read books beforehand. In fact, this video is trying to argue the exact opposite. But they are now explicitly communicating this about themselves. This desire, particularly for women in showbiz, to present themselves as intellectually and politically engaged people, might also be related to the rise of fourth wave feminism, which celebrates the idea of empowerment through individual personal development as opposed to collective action. Think about the CEOs and girl bosses of the world. Either way, suddenly, reading is the coolest thing that anybody could do. Then, in 2020, lockdown happened. And while it was a horrendous time for most people, it was a great time for book sales because it meant that people who may have previously been too busy could suddenly pick up that book that they'd been meaning to read. And the fact that we were stuck inside also meant that social media and the internet in general became our only window to the world. Both these things funneled even more people into online book communities. Which brings us to the current extreme popularity of books on social media and the social commentary around it. For a few years now, people have been criticizing the way that book influencers consume literature. One of the main critiques has been that the content that book influencers create follows the same pattern as lifestyle influencer content. Book hauls, for example, are to some people worryingly reminiscent of old school fashion hauls. In these videos, young women were seen showing dozens of articles of fast fashion clothing that were often very poor quality and which they sometimes only bought for the purpose of the video. So the idea of a book haul immediately makes people uneasy because it presents books not only as a consumer product, but a product that is low quality and even disposable, like the fast fashion clothes in those videos. Another type of content that has been widely criticized is the book collection format. Like the extravagant makeup collections of early beauty gurus, where the majority of the products were unopened and often expired before being used, book collection content has been criticized for promoting a type of hyper-consumerism that fetishizes the book object and makes the reader's interaction with the book's contents secondary. And while both these pieces of criticism are extremely valid, for some reason the most widely circulated critique of the online book community is that the people who share book content are only doing it for the aesthetic. There are already tons of videos on YouTube about aesthetics and the way in which consumer products contribute to ego formation, so I'm not going to go into that. All you have to know for the purpose of this video is that over the past 4 to 5 years, there has been a rising trend in young people trying to codify and express identity by putting together their favorite media, lifestyle products, and experiences to create a cohesive whole that will encapsulate who they are as a person. The most popular aesthetics revolve around beauty and fashion trends, like the clean girl and Y2K aesthetic, but we've also seen aesthetics that revolved around lifestyle choices, one recent example being the cottagecore aesthetic, and even particular social classes like the old money aesthetic, and specific countries and cultures like the Slavic girl aesthetic. I know. Inevitably, people began developing aesthetics around reading as well. One of the first aesthetics to emerge around books was probably the dark academia aesthetic, which involves a preference for reading Western literature classics, wearing English heritage and prep school-inspired clothing, and opting for visuals and color palettes that invoke autumn and campus life, typically at top universities. The trend also involves reading books that are set in a university campus environment, The Secret History by Donna Tartt being the most famous example. But increasingly, the act of reading and being a bookish person has become an aesthetic in itself. Examples of aesthetic book content include pictures of book covers or book stacks, pictures of people browsing bookstore or library shelves, and underlined or heavily annotated passages. Recently, GQ magazine published an article by a former booktuber who argues that nowadays people in the book community are mostly interested in being perceived as being well-read rather than actually enjoying literature. The writer criticizes the way that people have romanticized the act of reading through dramatic pictures and videos of themselves holding books or browsing the bookshelves of indie bookshops, and also the way that they fetishize the book object through excessive annotating and bookmarking of books that he thinks do not need that much explanation. And for some reason, in his mind, creating this type of aesthetically pleasing book content and critically engaging with books are mutually exclusive. If you post a pretty picture of a book, you must be too stupid or superficial to actually understand it somehow. This is not to say that all criticism of the bookish aesthetic is inappropriate. There are many ways in which overly identifying with an aesthetic can be harmful, not least because it pushes people to pigeonhole themselves. The past few years have seen the rise of trends like the coquette and sad girl aesthetic, and more recently, the dark femininity and female rage trends. Starting off as fashion and lifestyle trends, the media that they used as a point of reference quickly began to include books as well, to the point where female rage or unhinged women, as well as sad girl novels, became a category of books that people acknowledged.
The reading community began thus to create its own literary genres based on not just the books themselves, but the subcultures they were thought to belong to.
People who want to be part of the hot girl novel or sad girl novel or classics community might think that reading anything other than this type of book will weaken their membership to the group. So they're likely to stop themselves from discovering other books that they might really like outside of those genres. There's also a toxic aspect to being a book content creator when it comes to trying to keep up with social media algorithms that require you to post regularly and often. Speaking from experience, I'm not a fast reader, and I have on occasion wished that I could read and therefore post more. And I'm not the only one. Last year, the Instagram book community had something of a scandal when a content creator with 100,000 followers was exposed for plagiarizing other people's posts because she couldn't keep up with the posting schedule necessary to grow her platform. She eventually apologized and switched to making lifestyle content, which made people question whether she actually had a passion for reading or she just wanted to make popular content and the book niche was just as good as any. But these cases are extremely rare. And for the most part, the criticism that the so-called reading aesthetic receives seems to be rooted in a familiar combination of elitism and misogyny. While the GQ article doesn't refer to women and girls specifically, people have rightfully pointed out that there's definitely a gender aspect to its critique.
If you've spent time on BookTok, you would know that many of the creators on BookTok are young women. So I find it curious that the author of the GQ article repeatedly uses gender-neutral phrases to refer to these creators in a very disdainful way. I know he's speaking about young women. Why won't he just say that?
Once you consider that the vast majority of people on BookTok, Bookstagram, BookTube are women, it's hard to separate comments about how people only buy books because they look pretty or because they want to make themselves look interesting from gender stereotypes. Over the past 5 years or so, there has definitely been a shift in the way that people interact with books, particularly on social media. A phenomenon that I like to call the yassification of books. And I know that to yassify something has mainly negative connotations, but I use it affectionately. During this time, reading went from being perceived as somewhat of a niche and slightly dorky hobby to something that all the cool kids do. And our collective idea of what a reader looks like is now shifting from the stereotypical nerd outcast or not like other girls girl in an American teen movie to pretty much everybody, including very feminine women, which seems to be where the problem lies. While there are a lot of men and gender non-conforming people in the online book community, the people who receive the most hate, from backhanded compliments to straight up insults, are women. I've often received comments from men expressing surprise and wonder at the fact that I read real literature, and men who told me that I was dumb for not liking Kerouac or Hemingway. And female book content creators get comments about how superficial they are and how they just use books as props to take pretty pictures all the time, to the point where it's become a meme.
Bitch, we don't want the recipe to your mom, Peach Cobbler, bitch.
And it's incredibly annoying to see because in reality, these women are themselves writers or working towards their PhDs. Not that you have to do these things to deserve some basic respect. But this is to say that looking at somebody's social media feed and concluding they have no substance because they pay attention to the color palette is incredibly reductive and condescending and, well, misogynistic. Women's intelligence has been, and pretty much still is, constantly questioned online and in real life. And whenever a woman displays an interest in any type of niche subject, she is met with skepticism. It's the classic name 10 songs meme. The same TikToker also pointed out the following.
There's something that the author fundamentally misunderstands about BookTok when he says that actual reviews have become few and far between, just like BookTube before BookTok. BookTok and BookTube are not meant to replace book criticism. It's not a flaw that there aren't more critical reviews. BookTok is a fandom, or it's a constellation of overlapping and interconnected fandoms. And as we know from history, anytime there is a fandom that is driven by young women, from Beatlemania to One Direction fandom, it is very easy to deride that community and look at them as if they're silly and superficial and performative.
And it could well be the case that some of the women posting book content are being performative. But isn't it strange that we rarely accuse men of being performative, except about feminism? Lastly, as this TikToker points out, a lot of the women posting about books are quite young. Many of them still experimenting with their identity, their interests, and their likes and dislikes. Do they sometimes post cringy pictures of underlined quotes with little hearts around them? Maybe, but I don't know. I don't know if it's just me, but maybe we could just let women be. Maybe we should let them do stuff, grow up on their own terms, let them enjoy things. Speaking of which, if you've enjoyed this video, please like, comment, subscribe, etc.